Right here.
Right here. That's right, you said home videos.
So, this was a labor of love, and I'm glad you're here to view this. And in reality, you can see all of the sessions done for Loyola during this time period, except for a few that I seem to have lost in transition. Are now available at the Media Burn website.
Yay.
Well, the love comes through.
Pardon?
The love comes through. The labor of love comes through.
We're going to open this up for questions, okay? But I really want to thank Barry again for this labor of love, but also want to acknowledge the Logan Center for its contribution to preserving this important part of Chicago history. That, Barry's really given us a missing piece. That we have such difficulty, I think, in this particular era, archiving what's important, and that this is going to be accessible, available. A thank you to the Media Burn Archives as well. The rest of the tapes are absolutely fascinating, and it's just marvelous that you were able to do this. So thank you for digging them out of your basement. You've given us some really interesting background about your younger days on Maxwell Street and absorbing the scene, and very much like what you said about authenticity and how it is presented. But I was thinking if you could talk a bit more, because it's so unprecedented. How did you get access to these musicians, in the studio? You got them to the studio, but in their home. How were you able to get that candor and that that real freshness that's clearly there?
Well, I think it started probably in 1975, 76 when I want to thank my brother Stephen out there and his friend David Goldberg, that we actually went into the studio, sound studios that was engineered by Stu Black and someone from its own rights. And we did a series of piano players called Heavy Timber, and that was named by Jimmy Walker. I then went on actually wrote my master's thesis on house party pianos and underground music in Chicago from 1913 and 1927. It was then labeled Boogie Woogie. Before that it was Fast Western. Or Ludlow Joe, probably somebody from Joe from Ludlow, Mississippi, helped create this style. But it goes back, as I said earlier, that as a teenager growing up and working on Maxwell Street and trying to figure out, well, what is a root of something? I think I first looked at trying to figure out immigration of Russian Jews into Chicago. But rock and roll, being a product of rock and roll, I wanted to find that root, and it really was these piano players that was the root to me, an urban setting. So I think going and I think again taking music lessons as a kid, and my brother taking music lessons as well, and he found. Maybe we could talk to him about it, but he found Erwin Helfer, who was our gatekeeper. We saw Goldsmith as our gatekeeper getting into the checkerboard. There always has to be a gatekeeper when you're, again, the etic part of society versus the phonetic versus phoning. And trying to get that gatekeeper. And Erwin was our gatekeeper of sorts, and really connected with doing a session with Lion John Davis and Jimmy Walker and Sonny Land and Erwin, and we saw some of the pictures in this videotape, and Willie Maybone. And, I took Lion John to Houston, drove him down to Houston with Billy Boy Arnold, And as I said, trying to figure out, well, what is that, the language, and being able to understand the language as a teenager, and trying to do it as somewhat of an academic or non-academic of sorts. And trying to figure out what are all these connections, and trying to make, again, engineer a series to try to make these connections was important to me, to try to find that root. And, that's what we got. And this is just a little overture of what we got. So I think in that investigation, it brought me to, again, what is authenticity? And I think authenticity is the most important product of what we get out of all of this, and hopefully trying to relate that to the public, and being a teacher, I guess, is, we're always using this as a teaching tool.
So, to contextualize this a bit more then, you're training as a historian, you are a historian. Also, did it give you a sense of this particular time period that there was something significant about it? I'm thinking about the fact that this is a period where, the South Side and West Side clubs are in decline, the audience demographic shifts, the clubs move to the North Side. Did you have a sense that, I know this was pre-Bluesfest and you're getting ready for your neighborhood blues festivals that you put on, but were you thinking about the preservation aspect of it?
Well, I suppose, but I think it was more of not only preserving and teaching and being able to, I think in preservation you're able to leave some kind of a legacy for these fellas and Estella, and being able to tell this story, and even to the point where the next step was to actually do a series of live mini blues festivals in 1984 that included a Delta guitar workshop at Truman College, a boogie woogie celebration at the cultural center at that time, and being able to have these piano players actually play on a Bosendorfer. They'd be able to go to Europe and play on a Bosendorfer, but never anywhere in the States would they have that opportunity. And then the third program was this Maxwell Street Gospel Blues Bazaar. And I found out that anytime you did anything outdoors, you had to get permission from the Mayor's Office of Special Events. And prior to me working for the Special Events Office. And there really was no way of actually legitimizing that. I mean, it was by ordinance, but there was no way. So basically, I had the money, I had the place, I need permission, and, I was able to finagle Lois Weisberg permission, and they used it as a publicity event for the first Blues Festival. And it was basically a stormy day of Memorial Day. Never plan anything outdoors on Memorial Day. We were setting up a tent, and the tent was about to play, these guys are holding on to dear life, and they're off 3 feet off the ground. But then it ended up that we actually moved indoors to the Marcy Newberry Center on Maxwell Street, just west of Morgan, and we set up. We started to play, and at 12:05, Harold Washington walks in and announces the first blues festival, and the rest was history.
Questions from our gathering here today?
So how did you actually go from that to the Chicago Blues Fest?
So that was, again, I actually helped the office move from the 6th floor to the 7th floor. And stuff desks up in City Hall. And that first blues festival was somewhat set. I basically said we should document it, and actually it was interesting that the guy it's all documented at the Cultural Center, audio-wise on Betamax tape. supposedly that's a better audio sound. Probably nobody has a bathing machine. But as a result, that Maxwell Street event became one of the first neighborhood festivals. I was on voucher for that first year. I became director of neighborhood festivals as a result. I became deputy director of the office by the time I retired. And the second year, I convened a committee that we actually would meet at the checkerboard. Because prior to my getting a full-time job anywhere, the checkerboard was my office. And so I basically got a job as a neighborhood festival rep because it was like, not only was it the Memorial Day event of a neighborhood festival, I did a Labor Day program, post Blues Festival, with Lyle, again, this NE8 grant, right at the water tower. And it was a Labor Day, but it was a celebration for Sunnyland Slim because his birthday was ended up on Labor Day, or September 8th, so it's like the day after Labor Day. And so that's the ultimate Blue Monday is Labor Day. So we did that, and then in October we did a program to celebrate the Chicago fire that we held at the History Museum, the Chicago Historical Society, and actually celebrated Mommy Yankee, the last of the Red Hot Blues Mamas. And so I was doing that while working for the city and somewhat independent, and then I was able to finesse a job and it became a career.
Good job. I got a Blues Festival question. I think the statute of limitations is up, so the law. You have a phenomenal story. I remember about having to pay Chuck Berry away necessarily wasn't.
Well, I mean, it was all legitimate, really. But the thing is that there's a lot of interesting stories doing the Blues Festival. I mean, living this life and being part of this community is amazing. But Chuck Berry is a unique individual. To preface this, the year that we booked Chuck Berry, he was also booked to play a post-Pittsburgh Pirates game. And set a time. And Chuck Berry wants to be paid in cash before he plays, before a certain amount of hours. But he, the game went into extra innings. Post the time, that time he's gone with the money. So this is the kind of guy I was dealing with. The thing is that he wanted cash, and thank God I worked for the Mayor's Office Special Events, which like to bend the rules and like to make things work, which is unlike many city departments in a city that works. But, so I did get, the cash money. But I did not have a signed contract. And trying to get a signed contract and trying to get even a check through the city is tricky. So anyways, the day of the event, he pulls up in his Winnebago, drove up from St. Louis with his daughter and he's helping him drive. And we basically, I paid him in hundreds, and he took it and his Winnebago parked right on the plaza, the band show, and then he walks downstairs, and downstairs is Willie Dixon, Memphis Slim, Bo Diddley, a host of others, and you've never seen somebody's attitude change 180 degrees. That he was kowtowing and well behaved in front of his gods and icons. So it was an interesting. Like I said, there was many interesting events.
more about people you decided to include?
Well, that certainly is probably an interesting, concept in the sense that, to me, like I said, I was definitely focused on piano in Chicago. To me, that was the urban instrument. You cannot, we talk even a little bit with homesick, but you can't put a piano on your back and hit the road. It was really, it was the music of the turpentine towns in the Delta. You all familiar with what a turpentine town is? Turpentine was made out of pine tar. And lonesome pines of the Mississippi Delta, basically, there were a lot of turpentine towns. They would actually, they would make, as I said, turpentine tar was all done back in the 19th century to naval yards along the Mississippi, and they would have these, much like steel mills, they'd have turpentine towns. They were industrial centers within the Delta. And they would have piano players in these joints, and such as Dudlow Joe. And it then really migrated certainly north through Texas and St. Louis and up to Chicago. So it was really an urban, and then it was the music of the house parties. And that's going back again during Prohibition, pre-Prohibition, of these house parties that they're really congregations that would follow piano players. And certainly Jimmy Yancey and his range of musicians were important. And as I said, Irwin had this experience of that. He learned, certainly not, Jimmy Yancey died in 1951. But he really had a close tie to Little Brother and other piano players. And actually, it was his first live performance was that he accompanied Mommy Yancey because Brother couldn't make the gig because Brother was drunk. And so and Irwin had the car to drive Stella to Indiana for the gig. But Stella would always say that, if you play the clunker, she'll give him a look. But she said that she never had to give him a look. So I think, he had that affinity, and he was our gatekeeper.
When was that?
The first is,
Yeah, his first video.
it was in the late 50s, I think. As a gatekeeper, as I said with my brother, we had this piano, and I really found this piano, and I did, it's called Chicago Blues, an urban experience. It's not necessarily 100% of the blues history going to the Piedmont or going to the West Coast. And so picking, certainly players that we had experience with, Blind John Davis, who was the Melrose piano man, who played it, he went, it was like blinding the blind. When Big Bill Brunzi went to Europe in 1951 into France, they cheated him terribly, money-wise. He couldn't figure out the franc to the dollar. So actually, that's when John went over and figured it all out and got him back to the States. So, John plays a significant role with all these players, and hanging out at Tampa Red's house, that basically was the headquarters at that time, and pretty good in the state, and it was like Tampa's wife that got John the gig with Tampa because John was really musically literate, of sorts, because he went to blind school. He could figure things out. Sunnyland got Muddy Waters' his job at Chess. I don't know if you're aware of that, but he took him off the truck and got him his first recording gig at chess. So Sunnyland again was an important, and maybe I would have had money involved, but actually money had very overly protective agents. To tell you the truth. And I mean, but to me, Sunnyland, when we had this relationship, and he was, even when I went off to grad school with Penn, and I would call him up to figure out if I had a problem with my car. You could figure it out over a phone. I mean, it's special, it's very special character. But you don't see Billy Boy Arnold, which you'll see in a lot of these other tapes. When Billy Boy learned from John Lee Williamson and with Brian John, and the Myers brothers that played with Simon and SP. So this is just really, again, an overture. And then Jimmy Walker, who, little brother in Irwin, certainly in classic meaning that women singer, there was stories told at Brother's house about Chippy Hill, Trouble in Mind. But Stella was really, a special person in the sense that, again, not only being a widow of Jimmy Yancey, it's Poppy Yancey. And to me, that's really the mother and father of Chicago blues, is Jimmy and Mommy Yancey. So that is really the beginning of the urban Chicago blues, going back to the turn of the century, by 19, right after the Titanic, actually. And in the house parties. And, Jimmy taught, he loves Lewis and Albert Ammons. And or at least gave them their move forward to professionals.
Back to this fellow, Molly Yancey had an amazing way of singing, and she could be heard no matter what. And it occurred to me, perhaps she had to develop that during the house parties, otherwise no one could hear her.
Yeah, I think that, again, right, I think there is no amplification in the house parties. I mean, and that's why the piano, and certainly I think that was the demise of the piano when they went into the club and it was electrified. So I think part of that, electrification of that Delta root has certainly changed the formulation of what Chicago blues is about. Although I think the piano always played an important role in Chicago, even within the ensemble and the combos.
How old was Mom in that tape? Because her voice was so strong.
She had to be 81 to years. I mean, the blues of like, that was it. She was it.
When was it left released?
When that was, 81, 82. I mean, that was, I guess a similar time when you did the recording at Teresa's, because actually we got, Junior played the second set later that night, and so I have them on audio, not a cassette, that Ken Rasek recorded, but he wouldn't let us videotape it. Which I don't blame him. I wouldn't let myself do it.
You saw what happened with his and the Rolling Stones. On that movie they made, it's checkerboard with the Rolling Stones. His comes up, they won't get down. And he keeps playing, it's playing behind his back.
This was a showman. I mean, and this is, you can take this with a grain of salt, but this actually, was in Buddy Guy's band when they would play The Village, and a young Jimi Hendrix used to watch.
That's no deal.
You had a left-handed Jimi Hendrix, a left-handed Lefty Diz. Take your own conclusions. With all the flipping.
More context, Oli, maybe you would know that these first steps.
Lefty
Guitars
Diz.
all bedazzled.
Oh, that's Homesick James.
Yeah. Tell me about that guitar.
Well, Homesick, you know, and actually we have a videotape, he was working on my guitar, and he would, you know, Homesick was a metaphorical man. I mean, he would say, you know, he was hotter, he was so hot he could eat ice cream on the sun. And, you know, a lot of people basically push him aside. I mean, I think he is really one of the geniuses of blues in the sense. I mean, he built these guitars, and you know, so if he was working on a guitar, he would put his signature on it, and that was the sequence. And so I have sequins on my guitar. But you know, so he is really was one of the special people. I mean, he actually had ended up dating my grandfather, so we had really an affinity. And, but he, you know, just a unique individual, and certainly the blues life. And when these guys, I mean, you know, when they're like 80, 90 years old, I mean, it's amazing life that they've led.
Yeah, looking at the program, obviously it's edited, and I'm curious, did you keep the raw unedited footage as well in your basement?
Yeah, so I mean, actually, MediaBird has been able to digitize everything,
That's great.
and so it's actually online.
How many hours?
Pardon?
How many hours?
I think was it 20 tapes?
It's like 23 tapes.
Pardon?
Just 23 tapes.
Yeah.
Very nice.
What about Willie Dixon? Where does he fit in his play?
Well, I mean, I like Willie. He never really did anything bad to me. But, you know, and I'd rather not say anything in public, like quoting Homesick about Willie, but certainly an entrepreneur.
A question about the Chuck thing. I remember the radio used to broadcast the Blues Festival, but Chuck was not broadcasted. Was that he wanted like double the money or something, or?
Probably.
It occurs to me, especially when, you know, the material in checkerboard, where were the women? I mean, we've got obviously Mom and Nancy, but what women were at that time performing in the clubs, the club scene?
Well, I guess big time Sarah, Valerie Wellington. I'm not sure. Wasn't really quite part of the story yet, to
Yeah.
tell you the truth.
So do you have footage of some of those?
Microphone. Pardon?
Oh, do you have footage of some of the women?
You know, like I said, as part of my grant, I did not really, you know, I think Stella covers it all.
I have questions. Just a couple of things. This whole, you know, issue of archiving and the importance of it, I think is you know, something that we need to talk about more. It seems to me that so much of the blues history that we are discovering or trying to discover is held by private collectors, and it's not accessible, and that's why I think this MediaBird project is really so important. You've been, you know, involved in this for so long. You know, you've worked with the city. You know the difficulty of finding funding for projects. You know, Harold Washington has its archives, but it has no funds, you know, to catalog it, to curate it. The various blues museums that are, you know, here and there, not Chicago yet, but they're, you know, they're more sort of touristy, interactive exhibits. They're not really interested in archives. So I just like to hear what you have to say about the future of it. I mean, how can we preserve this in the ways that you tried to do here?
Well, again, I can't think more media are really doing what they're doing, video-wise. Certainly there's a lot of other ephemera. And I think probably the largest archive is probably down in Oxford, Mississippi, the Blues archives.
And you have a black mold problem?
Oh, well, I had a black mold problem too. But, and then I would say, the Center for Black Music Research, which Pete worked diligently try to get them on board with first doing this. Again, everybody has their priorities, and it's, and I think, again, it goes back to, well, why weren't these cats that were videotaped done with film, and why wasn't it done on commercial TV, and why wasn't there a full-fledged show being, either broadcast or had national circulation? And it was popular to a point, let's say. I mean, literally, right after this was done, Dan Aykroyd came in and did a ABC TV show. That was based, I think, actually he used my poster, so. And speaking of posters, actually, the graphics in this were done by Harold Porter, who did all the signs and street fronts on 43rd Street, with the glitter and the paint, the tempera paint. And so I just get off topic. But, so I think, commercialization, blues is, I think in some cases, folklorists look down at blues because it is commercially viable, but is it really commercially viable? So I think, in one case you have that academic folklorist that's saying that this is not folk music, and on the other hand, it's truly a folk music in the industrial age that has all the whole community, as I was saying, of the entrepreneurs and the performers and the fans. I mean, that's the total community. But it is of such a niche that it's, I think people that are trying to put out records know that it's a niche and it's not that commercially viable unless you try to pander to the audience and placate to the audience and put out loud guitar players.
So it all comes back to what you said about the demise. Real Chicago blues was piano blues, but with the electrification and then the commercialization. So, let me ask you about that now. Wizard of all things blues here. What do you see the future, given that the market niche is really small, and given that it's so dominated by, I would say the sort of guitar gods, for better or worse. Do you see it thriving in the future? Do you see it hanging on? What's your take on it?
I mean, people don't want to hear this.
I do. We do.
Folk musics do become extinct. And, you might like what you hear and you might enjoy it, but it's not necessarily a folk music anymore. And it's, again, pandering and placating to the public, and it becomes another chart-busting music. That people are basically looking for success at the downloads now versus the sales, whatever it may be. So, it's one of the reasons why I retired when I did, was that my friends were gone, and, to me, what I appreciate and understand his blues is gone. And, you know, else you're just pandering to the public.
Thank you for doing this and for all of the Chicago Blues Fest, which were very professionally done. I think one of the things that meant the most to me in this little segment was the Lurie Bell with his brothers, passing it on to another generation. And the significance of some of this is that the blues people of today, they were just coming of age in the era that you were filming there. And I think the key to keeping things going is to reinforce our blues people today who were beginning to lose already in the 50s and 60s. So, you know, I think if you build on that, you know, and maybe recall what the real origin was with a piano. I love that. Thank you.
Feral House Body.
Yes.
Like Thomas Kings.
Well, you know, just to, you know, hit on, I mean, it was really a pleasure, you know, like I said, you could see Steve, John Prime, but you also saw that, you know, when you're 9 years old, you have a hard time singing the blues. And it, you know, blues is an adult music, but you have to grow up within that tradition. And it was really, again, that was part of the design, was to again show these, you know, that how it is a folk music and his generations. And, you know, and I'm not that dogmatic that it in the urban setting that it's ethnically defined. It can be, you know, again, connections in a urban setting where you know, it's cross-cultural as well. But I think it's your experiences that you have that place you in the community. Thanks.
Gotcha.
Of the thousands of performances over 50 years, dating back to Maxwell, dating back before that. Let's pretend I have 2 magical tickets for one for you, one for your brother. And you can go back to any one performance, or night, or room, or club, or anything. Where would you go? Where would that night be?
Well, I think that's hard, but I mean, the 2 that stick out in my mind are certainly when Sunnyland and James Cotton ran a Blue Monday at the checkerboard. It certainly was magical, and bringing up people and coordinating that. Another one, you know, again, just was, you know, at the Chicago Blues Festival, and Lil Milton singing, "Hey, hey, the blues are all right," and a crowd of 100,000 people walk out of Grand Park singing long after the music stopped. And I mean, you know, I became very close to them too, so it was almost.
I think it's a deliberate effort on the part of a lot of people. And again, one of the things that I so admired you for when you were running the Blues Festival is that you always included the local South Side, West Side musicians who, you know, weren't that well known on the North Side clubs, and it was a great learning experience as well as, you know, great entertainment and fun time. So that kind of programming was deliberate, and this is interesting to me because I see a deliberateness throughout, you know, your career to present this music in you know, the way it should be. So I want to thank you for that.
Most welcome.